got Steve, pronouns he, him. And Steve is from Texas. He's calling about three things really that I love. He wants to talk a little bit about genetic entropy. He wants to talk about the flood, and I assume he's talking about the global Noachian deluge. And he wants to talk about young Earth creationism. Stevie, my mistake. Tell me a little bit more about your perspective. Let's get into this.
Hey, Erika. Hey, Eric. How are y'all doing?
We are doing okay, but hey, Stevie, if you're coming a little bit staticky, if you could maybe just back off the mic just a tiny bit, just to make sure that we can hear you as clearly as possible.
Okay, is that any better?
That's much better.
Much better.
Perfect. Yeah, so Erika, I know that we spoke about a week ago, and we've talked about, if I remember correctly, it was about molecular machines, and we didn't get to finish our conversation, so I figured I'd call back. And I remember from our conversation that you had mentioned genetic entropy, and you said that you felt there was little to no evidence for it, I believe is what you said. And that kind of perked my ears up. So I kind of wanted to ask you if you could explain that and what's your definition for that?
Yeah, of course. This is one of my favorite topics, right? So for those of you out there who might not know, Stevie and I chatted. We were talking with Dr. Adair as well last week here on SkepTalk, and I was like, call back next time I'm on, because it wasn't until the end of the call that I realized Stevie was a young Earth creationist, and I love that topic. I love to talk to young Earth creationists. So I was like, call back. Here Stevie is. So I'm happy to have this conversation. So genetic entropy is an idea that was formulated. Well, it wasn't formulated. It was co-opted by young Earth creationists, specifically by John Sanford, who wrote the book Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Cell. And he basically took this idea of a conventional biological concept called error catastrophe, and he put a young Earth creationist spin on it. And the idea is that, assuming that the Earth is about 6,000 years old, genomes are degrading. They're getting worse. They're getting more convoluted. They're getting less functional over time. And I'm using their terminology there. I don't feel that young Earth creationists or creationists generally have a proper definition for what they consider to be genetic information, what they consider to count as genetic entropy, and what they consider an increase versus a decrease. I don't think any of that is actually defined. But Sanford appeals to this by looking at a couple of different specific examples that he proposes in Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Cell, which was written, many, many years ago, about a decade ago, if memory serves now. And the reason why I say genetic entropy is not supported is, one, because a close friend of mine, Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal of Rutgers, he's got a channel here on YouTube called Creation Myths. He wrote his actual doctoral dissertation work on error catastrophe and viruses. There's no empirical support that genetic entropy is something that is happening when we look at some of the fastest reproducing organisms on the planet, which are, single cellular organisms, and viruses, which, whether those are alive or not is subject to debate, but they reproduce quite quickly. Dan found absolutely no support for that, and the scientific community at large has found no support for that. And the case in point to support that is that John Sanford and other young Earth creationists have talked about how genetic entropy just doesn't seem to apply or work when you look at bacteria, which is a really, really interesting thing for a young Earth creationist to say. It's almost as if they were like, okay, if we see genetic entropy, we should look in the place where it should be most obvious, which should be quickly reproducing organisms like E. coli. And then when we look at them, we don't see genetic entropy. And so they're like, well, those don't count. That's why I would propose empirically genetic entropy as they outline it is not supported. But the far greater issue with genetic entropy is a really, really simple one. It requires redefining fitness, which is a basic evolutionary concept that if you redefine fitness, you're also redefining evolution. And the way that they redefine fitness is in sort of an ultimate way. They don't appreciate the nature of a fitness landscape, and they really don't. And this is an issue I've seen with John Sanford many times before. They don't understand that fitness, what is fit, is context specific, right? So there are mutations that are beneficial in some contexts and detrimental in others, right? Which means there is no ultimate fitness, which means that if you're redefining fitness to be ultimate, you're no longer talking about evolution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think I have heard you kind of speak about that before, and there was a couple. I mean, you went over a lot of topics, so if it's okay with you, maybe we can just go one at a time. Is that
Sure.
good with you, or you want to stick to one specific?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So yeah, from my understanding, the way that this, just for your audience, is obviously every generation, I'm sure there's 60 to 100 new mutations that kind of enter the gene pool or whatever. Majority of those are neutral or near neutral. And so John Sanford uh, through his research, said that a lot of those mutations are removed through natural selection. A lot of those are moved through repair processes through the body. But he found, and this is supported by other experiments as well, but he found that even with those factors, there's still a net gain of mutation load. Now, you said that Sanford is a creationist. The problem is I looked into it, and there's two other studies of non-creationists. It's I believe these are molecular biologists that are not creationists in any way, and they also support the claim that there is a net buildup of mutation load. Do you disagree with that? Would you like me to give you those studies?
I want to ask you a question before you tell me what the studies are. Is Kimura the author of one of those?
No.
Okay, then yes, I want to hear who they are.
Okay, so one of them is by Michael Lynch. I believe it's titled Rate, Molecular Spectrum, and Consequences of Human Mutation. That was in 2010. And then there's another one. You got to forgive me because his last name is kind of strange. It's Alexei Kondrashov, and the title is Contamination of Genome by Deleterious Mutations, 1995. So there's three right there. So I really struggle to say that there's no evidence for this.
Right. So there are a couple of issues here. So one, actually, that friend that I talked to you about earlier, Dan Carnell of Rutgers, he and a population geneticist friend of mine, Zach Hancock, who also has a YouTube channel, have actually written and published work mathematically disproving, right, Lynch's support. I believe it was Lynch's, but it was definitely Sanford and their Sanford's original piece that referenced Lynch's work as well. So it sort of folds Lynch in there. I would assume, although I need to check, that they would include that 95 paper as well, especially since it's older than both Sanford's work and Lynch's work. But like mathematically, this doesn't square, right? And part of the reason is because it's a very simple conceptual error where if mutations build up, right, the whole concept of genetic entropy relies on the idea that these near neutral mutations build up over time. And then once an organism has accumulated too many of them that are nearly neutral, right? So sort of like grains of sand starting to tip the scale actually tips and it causes the genetic entropy error catastrophe in a population, right? That's the idea behind what genetic entropy is. The problem is the second a mutation causes any type of detrimental fitness effect to an organism, it will be selected against. So Sanford's entire idea is that these mutations they're not able to be detected by natural selection and thus weeded out of the population so that they can accumulate and cause negative impacts on organisms and the populations that they're within. But that is not what happens when we look at every single population of organisms, right? The second that something causes a detriment to an organism as far as its ability to reproduce, it's selected against, full stop. Right? That's why Kimura, who I thought you were going to mention, because Kimura gets referenced by Sanford and by Lynch all the time in his neutral theory in the 1980s, I think. I think it's 1980s, might be 1990s. Kimura specifically structured his experiments, which Sanford uses to support him, to remove the impacts of selection on beneficial mutations, right? Because that's what neutral theory is. It's the idea of how do things fluctuate without selection at play? But the second selection is available again, these near neutral mutations, they don't accumulate. They simply don't. The data don't bear that out. I don't really have anything else to add other than that. It's just there's not support for it. You have to change the definition of what fitness is, and you have to change the definition of what selection is in order to make it work.
So yeah, let's tackle that. So you talked about the definition of fitness. So I don't believe the definition is actually being changed. It's actually just being challenged. So fitness and mutation load are related, but they measure two different things. So fitness is basically a snapshot of how survival is now, while mutation load is what of course we're calling genetic entropy. I understand there's a difference in the definition there, but a population can seem fit today while still quietly accumulating genetic damage, which I believe is what we see in these studies. Do you disagree with that?
The problem is, Stevie, that's not what we're seeing, right? That's not what happens in these populations. Again, the studies that you're referencing, that's not what's happening in them. That's not what we see happening in populations now currently when we look at them. It's not what we see happening in bacteria. It's not what we see happening in large mammals or in quickly reproducing small mammals. We don't see this in anything. And a major problem for this isn't, like you mentioned, that fitness is a snapshot of the present. Fitness is a snapshot of the present, but it means the same thing no matter what. Like, the definition of fitness is the same everywhere. It's how many offspring do you leave behind, right? Especially as compared to other members of your population. So mutational load impacts fitness either positively or negatively. And in the context of genetic entropy, it's only negatively. It reduces an organism's ability to reproduce. It's deleterious, right? Organisms can't reproduce as much as their peers. And so the organisms that have higher mutational loads get selected against. Like, period, full stop. There is no way for these mutations to build up quietly in the background to the degree that they suddenly and overwhelmingly impact fitness and wipe a population out. That's never been observed. And again, it can't happen because the moment that it's detectable by selection, detectable, I'm anthropomorphizing it a little bit here, those individuals get selected out of the population.
So, let's talk about that, because in my research, what I found was that most mutations they don't suddenly become neutral one day and then bad the next. They're usually near neutral or slightly harmful the whole time. And because they're not harmful to a point that they're detected, that's how they begin to get passed on. You mentioned that we don't see evidence of this with molecular organisms, but I found 3 studies that disagree with you that say we do find that in those studies. I can give them to you if you like.
The ones that you already mentioned?
No, I'm talking about for molecular organisms.
Sure, yeah, cite them. I would love to see them.
We have one called Mutation Accumulation Experiment that's on E. coli.
And who's it by?
I wrote down here, a study found. I didn't write down I'm not sure. I didn't write down the doctor on that one. I'm sorry.
Okay. Just tell me the title one more time, and I want to find out who it's by real quick.
Sure. Mutation Accumulation Experiment, having to do with E. coli. And this is what the study found while you're doing that. Study found that the accumulation of deleterious mutations and a decline in overall fitness is what it found. You let me know when you're ready for the second citation.
Do you have a date on this? Hello?
Yeah.
Stevie, you there? You got a date on this?
I don't have a date. I'm sorry. I didn't write that down. I do for the next citation, but I didn't write down that one. I apologize.
The reason I ask is because the first thing that comes up is mutation accumulation under UV radiation in E. coli, which it's like, yes, if you expose organisms to radiation, mutagenesis is going to occur. They're going to have more mutations, and mutations tend to be neutral, but they can also be deleterious and they can also be beneficial. So this is something that's been known like since the 1920s. Organisms that experience heavy loads of deleterious mutations are selected against within a population. That's not genetic entropy. Like, definitionally speaking, it isn't genetic entropy. Not by their definition, not by conventional definitions. Now, I don't see anything else that's popping up here that is anything similar to the title that you just gave me, except for that. And that's not an example of genetic entropy or mutation accumulation in the sense of genetic entropy, which critically requires that mutations accumulate slowly in the background, undetected by natural selection, before suddenly overwhelming an organism. And that's not what happened in this experiment. You can read it right in the abstract.
Well, like I said, I didn't write down who it was for, so that's my bad. But there was another one, and I think you will know this one. This is Richard Lenski, 1988 long-term evolution experiment having to do with E. coli. I think he's observed like 70,000 generations. He found the same thing. And then I have another one having to do with picoalgae as well.
So that's a big problem though, Stevie, because that is absolutely not what Richard Lenski observed, right? From a conventional standpoint, the long-term evolution experiment saw the evolution of advantageous characteristics in these lineages, in these 12 lineages of E. coli. right? I mean, that's something that is appreciated by the entire scientific community in biology. The only people who try to spin that are creationists. Now, I'm struggling to understand how you could take anything from Lenski's lab and put it into a genetic entropy context. Because usually when creationists bring up the Lenski experiments, they're bringing it up to say it's not really evolution because the equipment for metabolizing citrate or whatever was there prior. That's usually what they go for. But there's nothing to do with Lenski that I remember off the top of my head, at least, that has anything to do with genetic entropy. Lenski and genetic entropy being together.
Yeah, the only quote I wrote down, because again, I did all this over the week or so, I don't have it at my disposal beyond what I wrote. But it says, I did write down a quote. It says, even in populations that evolved hypermutability and accumulated large numbers of mutations, fitness continued to increase, albeit more slowly, suggesting that the deleterious mutation load did not prevent ongoing adaptation.
Right,
that's the only thing I wrote down.
That sentence debunks you, though, Stevie. Fitness continued to increase, right? If fitness increases,
that's what I mean. They're separate,
right? But they're not, is what I'm saying. Like, definitionally speaking, this is why I say the genetic entropy people have to change the definition of what fitness is. In the context of evolutionary biology, a mutation can be, can seem on the face of it as bad as possible. But if it increases the fitness of the individual, it is a beneficial mutation, right? That is the definition, basic bare bones, when we're talking about evolutionary mechanisms and population adaptation over time. Or genetic entropy tries to put this on its head and say that any type of mutation can be, it doesn't matter how it impacts the fitness. It is objectively this or it is objectively that. And that's how they end up, supporting their idea of genetic entropy by having this ultimate idea of fitness. They'll talk about aspects of like, okay, it would be deleterious for an organism to experience a mutation to lose a tail or something along those lines. But we know that isn't always detrimental. Same thing with like, okay, an organism is born with fur that's thinner than its comrades. But if the climate is changing to grow warmer, that's actually a beneficial mutation, even if it involves the deletion of a gene. And this is the fundamental issue with genetic entropy, is that the thing that it's fighting with isn't evolution. It's strawmanned the entire concept.
I mean, I get what you're saying, and that makes more sense now, the way that you laid it out right there. But answer me this question, I guess. Can an organism build up near neutral mutations, but still increase in fitness? Can't the two things be true?
Yes, an organism can build up mutations, and I mean, this is just permanent changes to the genome, right? That's the population or the organism is evolving over time. But if it's increasing its fitness, by definition, it's not deleterious in the sense that genetic entropy wants it to be. Because evolution only deals with fitness in the context of increasing reproductive success. So if an organism is building up all of these mutations, but they're helping it survive, there's not going to be a moment in the future where all of those mutations turn on or something and then kill the organism and cause air catastrophe in the population, right? If it's beneficial to the organism in this given environment and it's increasing the fitness in that given environment, it's going to be selected for, not against. And they're not going to build up in such a way that they're going to destroy the organism. That just doesn't happen.
I mean, my understanding is it's kind of like a boat. If there's a small leak in the boat, so small you don't detect it, but the water continues to build over time. So yes, it may have fitness now, but in the future, it may not. Let me throw a scenario at you and tell me what you think.
That's what you said is perfect, though. You're right. What's beneficial in the present now may not be beneficial in the future. But the second it's not beneficial in the future, it is selected against. And it's culled from the population. Right? That's how selection works.
So let me ask you this. This is the scenario I was going to throw at you. Let's just say there was a catastrophic event and there was only 2 people on Earth that had to repopulate the planet. What would that do to the genome?
It would drastically increase. I mean, obviously, it would be catastrophic for the gene pool, and it would decrease the genetic diversity of that organism, of that species, not organism, of that species to very, very low, beyond viable means, depending on what species we're talking about here. Especially because as they reproduce, assuming they're mammals, they're only giving half their genes to their offspring anyway. So you're actually cutting the diversity down as they reproduce.
Yeah, so that's what I'm proposing. So if you look at the Adam and Eve story, you start with two people, perfect genomes. Those two people are going to there's going to be a devastating turn in their genome. And then by the time you get to the flood, the situation happens again with 8 people, which would still be devastating for the genome. And I feel like the evidence is supported by this. I mean, I know we do have genomes for Neanderthals. I mean, they do show a lot of inbreeding bottlenecking. Most of them do anyways. You agree with that, right?
Yeah, so the most recent Neanderthals from like 40,000 years ago have a lot of homozygosity in them. They're pretty inbred. But as you move backwards in time, they get less and less inbred, right? But that's not what you see in every population, and that's not what you see in every species that we have ancient DNA for. In fact, they're kind of an outlier. Like we've sequenced DNA from mammoths and I don't know if we've sequenced mastodon DNA. I know we've sequenced the mammoth DNA though. And we can tell the difference between a super inbred, super homozygous population like the last surviving mammoths on Wrangel Island versus regular run-of-the-mill mammoths that don't have a hyper inbred genome. Now, if genetic entropy is at play, then long-lived mammals should look at least similar in their genetic entropy, mutation loads or whatever. But they aren't, and they don't, right? And then there's the problem of like, how do you actually define a genome that is more entropic or whatever than another genome? We see an increase, quote unquote, increase in the genetic information in organisms today. Whether you're calculating that as the emergence of de novo functional new genes, right? Or whether we're defining an increase in genetic information as an increase in the size of the genome, right? Like there are plenty of organisms that regularly just duplicate their genome, but the whole thing, it's wild. You could talk about like the overall size, like that would be an increase in genetic information there. So the creationists have their work cut out for them in the sense that they need to define what genetic entropy is in the context of the actual way that evolution is proposed to work. Because no one is arguing with the version of no one is arguing for the version of evolution that they're fighting with and saying that genetic entropy, is a better hypothesis than that kind of evolution does not exist. There's no such thing as ultimate fitness. 2, they need to show that genetic entropy is at play in like a consistent and standardized way, right? And 3, they need to like form all that into a singular model that has a mechanistic that is mechanistically viable, right? That has a mechanism for it that explains what is actually going on. Like, how is it that selection is missing these deleterious mutations that impact the fitness of an individual? And then all of a sudden it becomes overwhelming. So they have their work cut out for them. And the genetic entropy stuff is not my forte because I'm not a geneticist, but I know enough about it to know that it's like they're shadow boxing with a different definition of fitness.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. Like I said, from the research that I did, there were non-creationist studies done, and I understand you disagree with them, but I mean, there were 3 studies done. It seems like is this a topic that you would say is debated? I guess.
No,
I mean, there has to be some sort of debate on this.
It's not, and I'll not to like ground pound you here, but like the study that you gave me the name for, I pulled it up, right? Like I read you the title of it. It was from 2017 by Shibai et al. It's titled Mutation Accumulation in E. coli. That's the title that you gave me, but the title that it is Mutation Accumulation under UV radiation in E. coli, right? And it talks about the accumulation of mutations in E. coli due to exposure to UV radiation. Again, this is a concept that we have understood since they were blasting fruit flies with radiation in the 1920s. That's nothing new. If you expose critters to radiation, right, they're gonna experience mutagenesis at a higher rate. But selection is still at play in these organisms. If mutations become too much for organisms that they impact fitness in any shape, form, or fashion, they will be selected against. But if they don't impact fitness, it's all good. That's why most mutations are neutral and don't impact the fitness of an individual. So the only paper that we looked up of the papers that you had from secular sources is not relevant to genetic entropy, because it's not talking about mutational load in the sense that people who like Stanford and colleagues would pitch it. In fact, let's see.
But that was,
you can't even,
you're referring to the one about molecular.
Yeah, you can't
you're
even
referring to the molecular one. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mutation load here. I was just going to say, you can't even control F mutation load here. It's not present in the paper. I mean, you can say that you had ones about molecular, like you were talking about like single cellular organisms here, but what I'm going off of is we looked up one paper and it had nothing to do with what you were talking about.
Well, like I said, I'm not sure if that was the one that we couldn't find the person in charge of it, but I know there were 3 that I gave you that had to do with human genome, and one of them was a scientist, Alexei Kondrashov, and I had wrote down that he in his paper, I quoted him as saying, "Why aren't we dead 100 times over?" That's literally what he wrote in his paper, based on what he saw. Now I understand there's a disagreement on. An apparent disagreement on definitions, but that's what he wrote.
Right. But he's talking about mutational load. Yeah, he's talking about mutational load with fitness, or not with fitness, excuse me, with selection not present. You see what I'm saying here? Like we're talking about 2 different things. We're talking about the rate at which mutations happen and accumulate in the genome of a critter, and then we're talking about what happens next. Genetic entropy is saying that those mutations accumulate in the background, unbeknownst to selection, and then boom, eventually they take the organism and they take the population out, right? But that's not how selection works. It's not how it's ever been proposed to work by conventional science, literally as a mechanism of evolution. So it's not a disagreement about definitions. There's only ever been one definition for fitness. There's only ever been one definition for what natural selection is and how it works at this basic level. And genetic entropy is not working within the confines of those definitions. So it's not fighting with any real evolutionary concept. Because the moment that a mutation becomes deleterious to an organism in the sense that it impacts its fitness, it's gone. It's selected out of the population, right? So these things cannot accumulate like rust on a car or like a leak in a boat, because somebody's going to notice the leak and patch it. That's how selection is proposed to work, and we don't see any exceptions to that. You're bringing up these examples of humans, but it's like I pulled up your E. coli example, and then I talked to you about the human examples. Human examples, whether we're talking about like Sanford or Kimura or anything, right? This selection is what purges these populations of these deleterious mutations. So what somebody from a genetic entropy standpoint needs to do, I mean, it's super simple. Just watch a population of bacteria. You should be able to observe error catastrophe, which is the conventional term for it, or genetic entropy. It should happen. But we don't see that. And the fact that you brought up the Lenski experiment, which shows the exact opposite of genetic entropy, and it has been, it's tens of thousands of generations of E. coli over the years. This is why Sanford, the guy who invented genetic entropy, says that it doesn't apply to bacteria, because this is the guy who invented it. The young Earth creationist who invented the gene gun and genetic entropy looks at bacteria and he says, we know it doesn't work on bacteria. It's not, for whatever reason, it's not happening to them. Because these Lenski long-term evolution experiment E. coli are just moving and shaking, just like they did in the 1980s.
Well, he can't have invented it because there was another study done before him in like 1995. I don't know how that could possibly be true, but
right.
Let me ask you this.
That's error catastrophe versus genetic entropy as proposed by Sanford, couched within a young Earth creationist context.
Let me ask you this. Can a buildup of near neutral mutations just, cause health issues that doesn't really affect fitness, like cause a shorter lifespan, or, in other words, not necessarily take the organism out, but damage the genome in some way? Can it damage the genome without actually affecting fitness or killing?
There's your issue again, though, Stevie, is that if it damages the organism in the sense that it shortens its lifespan, or, makes it, not be able to move as effectively, or, ruins its ability to synthesize vitamin D, or any of those things, that is impacting its fitness, right? Like what you're describing is impacts on fitness. If the organism is in any shape, form, or fashion less able to reproduce than the others within its population, Even if let's say they're born with their pinky toe out to the side and they're living on a savanna and, back in like 2 million years ago, that's going to impact their fitness because they're not going to be able to run as well. And they're going to be more likely to be eaten by a lion. So therefore that mutation impacts the fitness of the individual. So it's very, very difficult to propose that you can have a buildup of these near neutral mutations that are harmful to an organism but don't impact its fitness.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair statement. Let me ask you this. If the population is low, what would that do to a buildup of mutation? What would be the result? Because I know for most of human history, according to your view, we're talking very small populations spread out. So what would a mutation do in that community?
Generally speaking, according to basic mechanisms of evolution, smaller populations, genetic drift is greater at play, for lack of a better term, in smaller populations. But that has nothing to do with genetic entropy, right? Like it's going to work the same way mechanistically in a small population as it does in a large one, where if an individual is born with a mutation that in any way impacts its fitness, it is going to be selected against within that population. How strong and how fast that selection against that individual and against that gene or mutation or whatever is going to depend on how negative it is. Because, like, let's say, let's say you have a population of 10 grasshoppers. If you have a grasshopper that's born bright white, it's probably not going to make it a single generation because it's going to be immediately eaten by a bird before it even reaches sexual maturity. But if the mutation is less immediately detrimental, it may take longer for that mutation to be filtered out of the population or sort of culled out of the population entirely.
Okay. Well, I think I'll do some further research on this. Like I said, I did find 3 studies. I don't know that we'll come to an agreement on this. I think also I need to do more study as well, so I can kind of come back a little bit, with a little bit more evidence, perhaps. But since we're on the topic of,
I want to give you a paper since you're going to be since I want you to call back on this because this is an important topic. The paper I want to recommend to you by 2 friends of mine, a population geneticist and an evolutionary biologist, is titled Back to the Fundamentals, a reply to Basner and Sanford 2018. It was published in April 3rd, 2024. It's by Zach Hancock and Dan Stern-Cardinal. And it is a mathematical debunk of genetic entropy as a concept published in the conventional literature. Specifically, it was published in the Journal of Mathematical Biology.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll definitely read that and look into it because at the end of the day, Erika, I'm here for the truth. So if that is not the truth, I want to know. So I will do more research on that.
I love that. I love that about you, Stevie.
Now let me touch on a couple of things now since we're talking about population and some things I find kind of strange when we look back at the population of humans in the past. The first thing is, like, do you find it convenient that written records appear suddenly like in the 4,000 to 5,000 year mark, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago when humans were supposedly walking around for 300,000 years? Why do you think that is?
That's a really great question. Before I answer that, Eric, do you have anything you want to add to the genetic entropy convos that I just monopolized?
No, this is well out of my wheelhouse, so I'm just staying out of the way and learning. So no, please continue.
Okay. All right. Well, please interrupt me because everybody around here knows that I tend to monologue. And that
Absolutely,
goes for you too, Stevie. If I monologue too much, you got to interrupt me. I find it fascinating, but I don't find it any more support for, creationism or specifically Judaism or Christianity any more than I find that timing helpful to Hinduism, which, like the argument goes, that certain versions of Hinduism are even older than certain versions of sort of like the Pentateuch, right? So like the Hebrew Bible. Now, I'm going to add to that as far as I understand, historically speaking, the oldest written records aren't like that young, right? Like there's quite a bit of writing, like cuneiform. I think it's cuneiform that's older than what creationists would propose the age of the earth is, or at least communicate. Maybe not cuneiform, but like pictographs and things like that. Certainly that, right? Because Göbekli Tepe is something like 10 to 12,000 years old, and that's an entire complex, a temple complex, if you want to interpret it that way. So, I mean, I guess I would turn that on its head and say, do you not find it odd that, well, I don't know that I would turn it that way, actually, because I think that doesn't really, now the more I think about it, I don't even think that it's a very great point, because like you can point to the emergence of agriculture, which shows up before the emergence of writing. And you could say, don't you think it's coincidental that agriculture showed up, 12,000 years ago or whatever? Or don't you think it's coincidental that we domesticated dogs 40,000 years ago? Or don't you think it's coincidental that large brain case sizes in that globular shape show up 300,000 years ago? Why writing? Like, why? I think that statistically speaking, there's going to be something that emerges in full and ends up being semi-ubiquitous around the same time that young Earth creationists say the Earth started. But you could do the same thing with a lot of different technologies that have emerged in human history.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we disagree on dating, but like, I mean, the fact that really nothing was written down until 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Now, I know you said there's, I guess, pictures that were carved or whatever that you believe is before that, but either way, both really coincidentally kind of support a younger timeline, I believe. And then when you look at archaeology, kind of the same thing occurs. And the other thing is with languages. When we look at languages, we see that languages appear fully developed, complex, fully written. We don't really see any primitive languages that I'm aware of. And I'm sure through our history, languages actually break down. They don't get more complex. You can see that even with the human language, or the English language. We don't see them get more complex over time. So I find it odd that they were more complex, just a few thousand years ago when humans have been around for 300,000 years.
How do you define complexity in language then? Because I would argue the opposite.
Well, like most of the time is, the bigger words, more complex words. And as time goes on. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you could tell me if you have an example, but I believe.
Go ahead. Oh,
I was just going to say, if you have examples, I'd love to hear them. But my understanding is we use more complex words in the past than we have in the present. Now we're saying like, yo, what's up? We're not saying more complex, longer words.
So first of all, the introduction of slang complicates a language because now you have more words to learn that have more nuanced meanings. So I would say that argues the opposite direction. But also, those words are one particular pocket of the population using that. We have, in general, like when we have the advancement of science and we have the advancements of technologies, we have to invent words and invent new concepts and the words to describe those concepts as we get a better understanding of our planet and our and of science. So, like, if you were to go back in time and say, hey, let's talk about irony or let's talk about sarcasm or anything like that, they won't know what you're talking about because they didn't have those types of concepts. We do. Our language has enhanced and become more complex and more complicated in that regard. So no, I would say it's actually the opposite. As language progresses, it becomes more complex because vocabulary increases, concepts increases, slang gets introduced, multiple meanings to different words. We live in a time now where you can pick just about any word you want, and there's probably some type of innuendo hidden somewhere in there you can find. So no, I think you're completely off base there, and also like just as Erika was saying earlier, with what you're claiming is the emergence of fully complete languages all of a sudden, which I'm imagining you're probably pointing to the Tower of Babel and the Bible to explain that. Any religion, all religions have a series of claims about what happened in the past, and you can take any of those religions and any of those series of claims and line it up against real human history, and you can find parallels and coincidences. And you can have religious folks point at that going, see, this is proof of my religious myth because this event lines up with this happening in human history. And you can do that with any religion. I think there's I can't think off the top of my head right now, but I think it's maybe a Hindu belief about how the universe was formed actually lines up in a few ways with the actual science and the numbers and the multiple billions of years behind our understanding of the universe. We can look at Hinduism, and it has an explanation that happens to line up with some elements of science. Does that mean that Hinduism is true? No, it just simply means there's a coincidence there because there's a lot of claims in Hinduism. And I would say the same thing happens with Christianity. There's a lot of claims in Christianity, and if you line that up with human history, you're going to find some coincidental lineups. But that doesn't give you the license or it doesn't give you the ability to just ignore all the places where it doesn't line up. So sure, you can point and say, even if we could say, we have full examples of language at this point in time. Oh, it happened to line up with the Tower of Babel. Is that evidence that Christianity is true? I would say no, because it could potentially just be a coincidence. You would need more evidence than that to establish Christianity as being true, not just saying, oh, this happens to line up with human history.
I think there's a bit of an elephant in the room on that one as well, because it's like, okay, what's the event that virtually immediately precedes the Tower of Babel, right? It's the global flood. And if you interpret that as global, if you hermeneutically propose that it's saying it's a global flood, young Earth creationism is going to run into a massive problem because there is no evidence, zero, like zip, zilch, nada, that a global flood occurred on the face of this planet. And geologically speaking, we would be talking about the biggest event ever from a geological perspective. If young Earth creationism is the legitimate history, the global flood is the biggest thing that could have ever possibly happened. And because it's a global flood, it makes very specific predictions on what we should see in the geologic column, taphonomically with the organisms, radiometrically speaking with the dates, how the sediment would be laid down, like, waterlogged ash versus, flooded forests and all of these different types of things. And we see none of that, right? Instead, the geologic column reflects this very ancient history that is corroborated not just with regular old geological processes, but independently via radiometric dating, via ice cores, via dendrochronology, via the rate at which the continents move apart from one another, using varves, using the rate at which coral grows and atolls. Like, it all converges on the same extremely ancient timeline. And I don't bring that up to try to say, oh, okay, let's pivot and talk to something else. I bring it up because your point, as Eric outlined it, is basically to say, okay, well, young Earth creationism or a creationist time scale says that the approximate time that civilization starts is also the approximate time we see complex language emerge. And you want to use that sort of in favor of young Earth creationism to give it sort of legitimacy, to lend it legitimacy. Well, one, I don't think that's particularly helpful because, like, as Eric said, there are many different religions that make many different predictions, and some of them get some things right some of the time. But far more importantly, everything that is scientifically testable, that is a type 1 experiment in the sense that it would support or deny creationism if it was to be tested. Everything that's relevant to young Earth creationism in particular falls flat on its face.
So yeah, you guys covered a lot there. I think, Erika, that is a very bold claim to say there's no evidence for the flood. I do believe with a friendly spirit, I could make you eat those words very quickly. But
I would love that. I'd love that, Stevie. I want that badly. I want to have a conversation about call and talk about the flood with me.
So do I. I do. But before we jump to anything, I do want to say I'm not the topic that I'm going over today is not about the Bible. So the evidence I'm pointing you to is not. I'm not referencing back to the Bible. I'm just looking at the evidence. I could give you plenty of evidence why the Bible is more reliable than something else, but that's not what I'm trying to do right now. Now, like I said, you guys covered a lot, but if I could say, we can trace these languages back into groups. I'm sure you guys agree with me. You can trace English back to Germany or to German and the like. The problem is like when we do that, we can, it kind of aligns with the biblical account, to be honest with you. And not only that, but there's certain languages which have they're like isolated languages. In other words, they just appeared out of nowhere with no predecessor. So I just find that convenient. I'm not saying that this is absolute evidence. I'm just saying these are all coincidental stuff that I thought I would bring up. The other thing is, do you guys know how old the oldest living tree is?
Sorry, no. Stevie, I was coughing. I choked on some water. It's about 6,500 years. It's a bristlecone pine, right?
4,500 years.
Say that again.
4,500 years. So roughly around the biblical time frame, which I find interesting as well. So, but yeah, I don't know if you guys want to stop here or if you want to continue into evidence for the flood. You let me know. I can always call back another day.
I think there's a bit of a problem there, Stevie, right? Because so organisms don't tend, like when we look at longest ages for organisms, right? From a creationist time scale, the prediction would be something like 6,000 years. I looked it up in the background just because I wanted to get myself correct on this. The oldest bristlecone pine is in the White Mountains. It's Methuselah, which has a verified age of 4,856 years. Now, I don't know if that's the oldest tree, right? Because trees that are still living aren't necessarily the oldest trees. Let's say we found a bristlecone pine that had been incorporated into a Roman ship, right? Well, we would know that that bristlecone pine is however old the rings you could count in that log were, plus the amount of time that has elapsed since it cut down to now. So if you found a bristlecone pine that was the same age as this one, approximately 5,000 years old, from, 20 CE or 20 AD, however you want to say it, then that thing would be, approximately 7,000 years old. So it's not necessarily living trees that keep the score, which is why it's important to turn to things like coral clocks, because we have coral atolls that are, when you take into account the depth of the coral atoll, at Eniwetok, I think that's what it's called, they're significantly older than the oldest living bristlecone pine. But the bigger problem with this bristlecone pine just comes from it in and of itself. It comes from Methuselah's age. At 4,800 years old, it's older than the global flood. How did this scraggly little bristlecone pine survive a flood that covered by 20 cubits, if memory serves, the top of the highest mountain for at least 40 days and 40 nights, but significantly longer, when we can't even get an olive tree to survive submerged in salt water for 40 days and 40 nights?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's, first of all, it's around the time of the flood, but I would say that we have seen trees form more than one ring in a year. That is something that we have observed. So I would say that
that's
when
true.
You factor that
that's
in,
true, but
like,
I've
that
heard
would
that
put you
one
about
before.
the time of the flood.
That's true, but I've heard that one before, Stevie, and it's not very common for trees to form more than one ring in a year. It's way more common for them to not form a ring, because the only time they form two rings is when nutrients are just absolutely pervasive, right? Like when there's enough to grow that much in a single year. But bristlecone pines live in arid, harsh conditions high up in the mountains, right? So they're actually in the group that more often than not doesn't form a ring every year. So it's usually the age that we give to bristlecone pines, are usually underestimates for their age, as it tends to be the case for trees that live in harsh conditions.
Well, like I said, I mean, I'd have to look into it further. I know that I thought I came across an article that said that they've observed multiple, not just two, but multiple rings form within a given year or so. I'd have to go back and do more research. I'm not prepared for that right now, but I just know that there are some studies out there. So either way, I would say it's within the margin of error. I mean, that time around the flood, I think the flood was like 4,600 years ago. So it's close. I believe that tree is after the flood. That's my belief.
I think it depends on who you talk to, right? Like, I think it depends. AIG gives a number that's like 4,400, but it's give or take. So I'm willing to say, if you want to propose that it's like the first tree that formed after the flood, that's fine. That's another story, right? But then you can't use that tree as support for the age of the Earth. You see what I mean? Like, if you're going to say, "Oh,
no, I'm just,
isn't it coincidence?" You know what I mean?
Yeah, just to be fair, I'm just pointing out, like, at this point, I'm just pointing out coincidences. So I'm just saying it's a coincidence, nothing more than a coincidence. I'm not saying it's a way. And I'm curious why we don't find 10,000-year-old trees, but I'm just saying it's a coincidence.
Well, Stevie, maybe just trees don't live for that long, right? Because the whole idea behind evolution, and not idea, but a key component of evolution is death. You need to have the new generation take over to reproduce with those mutations and then die out and let that next generation take over. If we had species that lived for tens of thousands of years or even longer than that, we would see evolution behave totally differently in some cases. But death is a key component of that. So the fact that we don't have trees older than 4,000 something years ago is expected under the model of evolution. We don't expect things to absolutely last forever under any system, really, unless you're a Christian. You think, God is like, maintaining things magically to keep them from decaying and such. But even if that is the case, that we don't have any other living organisms from before when God supposedly created the earth, you said it yourself, it's a coincidence. You're looking at how things can kind of line up and grab you that and going, oh, that's interesting. It's interesting, but it's not evidence. That's the problem there.
And I have a problem with that too, because it's like, that's like going to, that would be like going to a forest and finding one tree that's grown in this perfect Y pattern and saying, isn't that incredible? Doesn't that support the notion that, a God who loves the letter Y was here because it said so in this book that there was going to be, that he loves the letter Y. And so that's support for that. And then it's like, you're in a forest with tens of thousands of trees, the overwhelming majority of which are not shaped like the letter Y, right? Like I think about something like Methuselah, and I think about, how it's not 6,000 years old, right? It's not 4,400 years old. It's 4,800 years old, which is an inconvenient age for the flood. That's fine. We could just assume that it's afterwards. It's cool. But then I look at every other area of geology, every other area of astronomy, every other area of paleontology, and what I see is a ubiquitous and singular answer that the Earth is older than 6,000 years old, right? Radiometric dates corroborate one another across space and time. They corroborate historical records wherever and whenever we can make that comparison. We know that they work because of that. They corroborate the rate at which the continents move apart. They corroborate the rate at which coral grows. They corroborate the rate at which varves form or speleothems form in caves that are at complete opposite sides of the world. If you want to talk coincidence, the oldest tree being an age in between 4,000 and 6,000 years old is nothing compared to the coincidence that you would require to get all of these independent geological, astronomical, and paleontological processes to agree in lockstep to give the illusion that the Earth is actually very old. So I don't find that to be convincing, and I find it, I get frustrated when these things are presented in isolation, because it's like, as Eric said, coincidences do exist. I don't even think this is a coincidence. I don't find it compelling even in isolation, but especially in the shadow of everything else. And I looked it up in the background because I was curious. And like, we have clonal organisms that are proposed to be older than Methuselah. Colonies of aspen trees like Pando, glass sponges, individual glass sponges found in the East China Sea are proposed to be more than 10,000 years old, which is quite a bit older than 6. So it's like, I don't know. Like, you're going to find an organism that's going to be the right age, I think. But that's not really how science works with regard to how we come to a conclusion at large.
And Stevie,
yeah, to be fair, I'm
go ahead, Stevie. Go ahead and respond.
I was just going to say, to be fair, I'm not trying to elevate this. I'm just mentioning the coincidence of it. So I'm not trying to elevate this as a a thing that's that this is it, case solved or anything like that. I do think if you would have talked to me 2 years ago, Erika, I would have agreed with you on everything you said. So I have looked into just about all that stuff, and I felt that the evidence was pretty overwhelming, and it did line up for me. And I'm always open to talking about that. So, but yeah, I want to be fair with my time. I don't know if there's another theist you guys want to talk to or something, or do you want me to move on to evidence for the point?
I'd like to maybe wrap up with a couple of more fundamental questions, Stevie. I'm guessing, I haven't said it explicitly, but I'm guessing you're a Christian and you believe the Bible is an accurate retelling of history. Because we talked a little bit about the Tower of Babel, and I know you said you weren't invoking it, but I suspect that you believe that that's actually history. And you're talking about the flood and how we have particular coincidences that seem to support it. You seem to be going after ways of confirming these stories. Let's go at it from the other way. Can you name me one thing that would falsify your belief in it? One thing that would falsify the story? Like, we found one thing that would debunk the flood, what would it be?
Well, I haven't found that. Otherwise, I wouldn't believe it.
Well,
but there are things that we can't
I understand.
explain. Would you like me to give
Hold
you
on,
some
Stevie.
of those?
Stevie, maybe let me rephrase my question because I don't think maybe I wasn't very clear. We're talking about falsification criterion here. All right. So, for instance, I'll give you an example for evolution. Okay, a falsification. One of my falsification criterions for evolution, criteria for evolution, is if we found a mammal fossil in Precambrian rock, that would destroy evolution, completely blow it out of the water. We found a mammal fossil in Precambrian rock. If that happened, evolution is false. Can you give me something similar for the flood? If we found this, then the flood is false.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're talking about figurative.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not even
here.
figurative, just a possible thing, right?
A possibility. Okay.
Yeah, has to be possible
here.
but it would show the flood is false.
All right, let me see. Knowing what I know,
like maybe I can help you here. If we found a tree
throw me some.
if we found a tree that was 10,000 years old, the flood is false.
I'm sorry, you cut out there. Would you mind repeating that again?
Sure. If we found a tree that is 10,000 years old, the flood is false.
Well, I would say that I don't agree with the dating methods. So that wouldn't convince me.
Okay, hold on. I'm asking for a yes or a no here. If we found a tree that is 10,000 years old, the flood is false. Do you agree with that statement?
If you could verify without a shadow of a doubt. A living tree, is that what you're talking about? Or any
tree?
A
living tree. A living tree. Sure. I'm not saying we found one. I'm just saying
if it's an actual tree, I mean,
then the flood is false.
Yeah, if it's an actual, I would say that would make me seriously question it. I know that there's trees that like grow together, and people point to those. But if it's an actual tree, then that would definitely make me question it for sure. Yeah.
Well, if it makes you question it, it wouldn't falsify it. I'm asking for something that would just like destroy that flood myth, right? So, do you have anything like that?
Well, I mean,
I gave you one for evolution.
Yeah, I mean, like with evolution. I mean, if you could give me a transition that near unbroken transition from, let's say, an invertebrate to a vertebrate, or if maybe they were able, maybe even if they're able to do that in a lab, that would probably falsify.
What do you mean?
But
like, I don't understand. What do you mean, like an unbroken I don't know what you mean by unbroken transition. Like, are you talking about like we take an organism in the lab and evolve it into a vertebrate? Like, I don't understand what you're saying.
What I'm saying is like when you look at the observable evidence in the fossil record, in molecular organisms, we're not seeing them transition into something else unless it's big. They point to big jump, like leaps and bound changes in the fossil record, which means that there has to be missing transitions in between. And then when we look at the molecular side of things, like the E. coli long-term experiment, they've had 70,000 of those, 70,000 generations, and
Stevie,
they're still
Stevie,
E. coli.
I gotta stop you. Stevie, I gotta stop you here. Recall back to my falsification criterion for evolution, how simple it was. I gave it to you in one sentence. Okay. If I found this, evolution is false. And you're saying an unbroken transition from an invertebrate to a vertebrate would falsify the flood? That I don't even see how those would be related.
Any transition that I would say any transitions. If I could see it, observe it, either in a lab with molecular organisms or in the fossil record or anywhere. If you could show me any example of a near unbroken chain of
but isn't that what
organism evolved into a different type of organism?
But how does that disprove the flood?
I wasn't sure. I mean, you asked me about evolution, so that's why I gave you an evolution
I used it as an example for my falsification criterion for evolution. I'm saying, what do you have for the flood? I gave you an example of how evolution would be falsified. I'm asking you, what would falsify the flood? Give me one thing that you could potentially discover that would falsify the flood completely.
That's a really hard question because I've done so much research on this, and I've gotten all my questions answered through my research.
So,
let me see.
Okay, and
I don't know. You kind of put me on the spot.
I'll go ahead.
I could probably think of it in 5 minutes.
That's fine. I'll go ahead and accept an answer of I don't know, and that's a perfectly honest and fine answer. Okay, but the problem here, though, okay, it highlights an issue with the way you're approaching the subject and the way scientists approach the subject. All scientific claims and all scientific theories have falsification criterion built into them. Okay, gravity. If I could pick up this pen and let it go and it flies away from the Earth, I falsified gravity, the theory of gravity. I told you earlier how we could falsify evolution by finding a rabbit fossil in Precambrian rock. We can do that with germ theory, atomic theory. All other fields of science all have falsification criteria built into them. You just admitted you don't have one. And so if you're sitting here and you're coming here, and I think you've been a pretty good interlocutor so far. It's interesting listening to you and Erika. But the thing is, though, if you don't have that key component, then you're in a position where you are doing nothing but finding confirmation. And that's an issue. Because if you can't admit that, hey, it is. Because if you don't have falsification criterion for your claim, then you are, by definition, can't only find confirmation for it. And I can come up with any manner of claims, religious and otherwise, with no falsification criterion. And I can find all kinds of evidence for that. I could sit here and say, hey, I think we're living in a simulation run by aliens. And the reason that we have so many languages is because the aliens introduced those languages into the simulation about 4,000 years ago. Hey, Eric, how would you know if you were wrong about that? I don't know. Like, I would be in a position of only finding coincidences, as you put earlier, to support my explanation. But if I have nothing to disprove it, then I am trapped in a room with no exit. I am trapped in a room with no exit. It's a belief room with no exit door. And that's an issue. So, and I'm not trying to beat you up over this, but I'm trying to say you have a fundamental difference in your approach to how you're researching and how all other scientists research.
Eric, to be clear with you, my answer was I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I'll remind you, I was an athist before I was a creationist. So I did not.
I don't care. That's the thing. I don't care. I don't care where you're. So Stevie, I don't care where you're coming from. Stevie, I don't care where you're coming from. I care where you are now. Okay. And I said it's totally fair to say, I don't know. That's fine. That's a great first answer. Okay. So I do encourage you to go and think about it and go, okay, what can I potentially find that would show me to be wrong about this? Because what you've already brought to the table.
I did give you an example. I had mentioned the fossils.
But then you said that, well, we're talking about evolution, and I said I was talking about the flood. But here's the thing, though. Even if scientists could somehow produce to you what you asked for, a full record, transitionary record from an invertebrate to a vertebrate, there is still a way to fit that into the flood narrative. It wouldn't falsify the flood. It needs to be something that shows that this explanation is wrong. Finding a rabbit fossil in Precambrian rock would mean that rabbits somehow developed far before any other mammals or vertebrates and somehow developed and existed without oxygen on the planet. Like, discovering something like that would obliterate evolution. We would have to find a different explanation. And I'm asking you, what do you have anything for the flood? And that's, you say you didn't have it, so that's fine. Go ahead and take away that question, think about it, and then come back and talk to us again about it. But if you don't have just that one simple thing, then you're approaching it way different than scientists are. Because all scientists go for, what's the falsification? All experiments are designed to falsify the claim. The experiments aren't designed to confirm. The experiments are designed to, if we see different types of results that we expect, then our assumptions, our hypotheses, our theory is falsified. That's how that science works.
I think too, from a perspective of the flood, I would propose, I don't know what your falsification criteria would be, but everybody who knows me knows that my favorite argument against the flood is the heat problem, right? Like the flood is precluded. Yeah, the flood cannot have occurred because the amount of heat generated in order to basically make the flood something that is responsible for the entirety of the geologic column, or even just the majority of it. Like, it doesn't even have to be the whole thing. It can just be most of it. Is enough heat, even excluding the accelerating radiometric decay, like just keeping it with, standard processes of like cooling off the magma, moving the tectonic or moving the continental plates around, like all that kind of stuff. That's going to be enough heat to like vaporize the granitic crust of the Earth. And like, to me, that's preclusionary. My experience with talking to creationists about that problem for the flood has been they usually appeal to a miracle to make that a solution, right? But then it's no longer a scientific hypothesis, and that's an entirely different, conversation. You said something very interesting there, and we do have to let you go here soon because we can't do one call. I would love to continue this conversation, but we have other callers that we probably need to get to as well. But since you're going to be looking this stuff up, doing deep dive, come back another time because I hope you call back. Please, please, please call me back and let's talk about the hominin fossil record, right? Because you're talking about transitions, in unbroken transition. Like, brother, I got one right behind me. From Sahelanthropus chilensis up to anatomically modern Homo sapiens, I would propose that the hominin fossil record is just about as unbroken a fossil record as you could ask for, given the incomplete nature of the fossil record. Humans descending from more basal ape ancestors in the Miocene. And we could talk about other transitional lineages that are proposed, like cetaceans. The whales from Indo-Hyas is another really good one. Synapsids and therapsids from reptile-like mammals is another good one. And then to more modern mammals from synapsids is great as well. Tetrapod transition from Eusynopteron-like fish is a good one. Birds from dinosaurs, or I should say from non-avian dinosaurs, is a good one. When I'm saying that these unbroken transitions, I'm saying like we see the emergence of the characteristics that make the modern group unique emerge slowly through geologic time, from more primitive versions to more modern versions, and then that exists geologically in sequence. I think that's wonderful support for evolution and a wonderful preclusion to creationism. But to Eric's point, I think you're going to want to look into the heat problem as far as what would falsify the flood. I would propose that the heat problem falsifies the flood.
Yeah, I have looked into all those, the heat problem, the hominin. I'd love to talk to you about that as well. And, I have my, we don't have time to talk about it now, but yeah, I'll just end with this. I think that's a fair question for you to ask, Eric. I think it's something I'm going to definitely go back and think about. I think you asked me out of nowhere, and so I didn't have a response. I'm sure there is one out there, but I would urge you not to make assumptions about me, especially when you don't know me. So I would urge you not to make assumptions about me, especially whenever
Stevie, what assumptions did I make about you?
But
what assumptions did I make about you?
The assumption you made was that I'm looking for evidence to confirm my belief, when in fact I wasn't even a believer in any of this when I started my journey. So that's definitely not a true assumption. But I do appreciate you guys having me on. And Erika, maybe we will talk about the hominin next time, and we can talk about how they're like where they a lot of them lived at the same time and all that good stuff. So, but I appreciate it. Unless you have another question for me, I'll dip out.
Call back, Stevie. I want to talk about hominins with you because I know of contemporaneity, and this is what my doctorate is in. So this is something that all this other stuff. Like I know enough about genetic entropy to talk about it. I certainly know enough about geology to talk about it. But if we talk about hominins, then you're actually talking to somebody who has the education to back that up in a formal sense, and I would love to have that conversation. But yes, we do have to get to other callers. So thank you for calling in, Stevie. Talk to you next time.
See you, Stevie.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Hello, I'm Jimmy Snow, executive producer for The Line and avid candy eater. Hey, if you'd like to support this channel, you can do so now on Patreon or as a channel member with tiers specific to supporting specific shows and hosts. And it also supports our ability to expand programming going forward. You could also leave a super thanks down below, get a little special highlighted comment, and I'll tell you what, you could hit like and you could hit subscribe. Now, here are some video suggestions so we can fudge that algorithm. Go with one of ours. Forget everyone else on YouTube. I'm begging.